Okay, so this morning we are in the 5th week of Lent, and it's our 5th week of gazing at the cross, recognising that there's more going on here than meets the eye. That the cross is not just about one thing, that it's a lot of things. And my hope is, I guess, that in seeing the cross in these different ways as we've done over the last month and a bit, it doesn't just make us more knowledgeable theologically, but it forms and shapes our lives. And we talked a little bit about that last week, about living cruciform lives. This week, what I want to do, I guess, is talk a little bit about how the cross is the axis of love that refounds the world. The idea that the cross is actually part of how Jesus' kingdom breaks into the world and reshapes it in ways that maybe we take for granted a little bit. Or we need holy imagination to see. Because sometimes I think we just look at the world around us and we think, oh, well, that's the way it is, and it's the way it's always been, and it's the way it'll always be, and we just kind of head down and bum up and off we go. But the cross is something truly revolutionary, and it changes the foundation of the world. And hopefully by the end of this you'll see where I'm going. So we're going to reflect on John chapter 12, verse 20 to 33. It'll be on the screen. It says, "Now there were some Greeks among those who went up to worship at the festival." That festival is Passover. "They came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee, with a request. 'Sir,' they said, 'we would like to see Jesus.' Philip went to tell Andrew, and then Andrew and Philip in turn told Jesus. Jesus replied, 'The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Very truly I tell you, unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a single seed. But if it dies, it produces many seeds. Anyone who loves their life will lose it, while anyone who hates their life in this world will keep it for eternal life. Whoever serves me must follow me, and where I am, my servant also will be. My Father will honour the one who serves me. Now my soul is troubled, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour? No, it was for this very reason I came to this hour. Father, glorify your name.' Then a voice from heaven, 'I have glorified it and will glorify it again.' The crowd that was there and heard it said it had thundered. Others said an angel had spoken to him. Jesus said, 'This voice was for your benefit, not for mine. Now is the time for judgment on this world. Now the prince of this world will be driven out. And when I am lifted up from the earth, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself.' He said this to show the kind of death he was going to die. This, on a number of levels, is an extraordinary encounter. And we're going to revisit it sometime after Easter. There's a couple of things that occurred to me during the week about this encounter that I want to kind of share, but they don't fit with today's topic. One of the things I want to know, though, is why these Greeks want to see Jesus. What do they imagine is going on? Do they want to see the guy that raised Lazarus from the dead? Because stories would be spreading about that. Do they want something from Jesus? Are they just interested in seeing Jesus, the superstar? Or do they want him? Do they want his way of life, his truth in their lives? We don't really know, because according to the story, the Greeks actually never meet Jesus. And I think that's really interesting. What goes on is the Greeks find one of Jesus' disciples, Philip. Philip is the only disciple who has a Greek name. We think he's from, or it says he's from Bethsaida in Galilee, and it's possible that Philip's father was Greek and his mother was Jewish, thus being fluent in Greek, which is why these Greek worshippers come and find him. Anyway, for whatever reason, these Greek worshippers, they find Philip, say they want to meet him, and then we just don't know. We don't hear anything more about them again. And instead of this being a story about some Gentiles meeting Jesus, it becomes something else entirely. The request from these Greek worshippers passed on through Philip and Andrew triggers something in Jesus where he begins to talk about his impending death. See, Jesus understands that what he is doing will not stay confined within the Jewish world, but it's going to reach beyond those borders into the Gentile world, which is to say, the whole world. Jesus is aware there is something bigger in play going on here. And he talks about this, and he says, the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Now, you need to keep in mind that in the Gospel of John, when Jesus talks about being glorified, he's talking about going to the cross. So for John, the cross is not the humiliation of Christ. It's the glory of Jesus. This is Jesus talking about his coronation as a king over the whole world. That's what we're seeing played out in this account. Jesus talks about grains of wheat falling to the ground and the greater productivity that comes out of that, or the greater expansion that comes out of that. And then he says, my soul is troubled. And I reckon that's fair enough. You think about it, like if you knew that within 3 or 4 days you were to be crucified, I reckon your soul would be troubled too. We need to remember, as we read these stories, particularly the stories of the Passion Week, that week from Palm Sunday to Good Friday, we need to remember Jesus is not an actor in a play. He's living this out in real time as a real human being. The response from heaven is like thunder. I have glorified it, and I will glorify it again. And then Jesus says this. He says, now is the time for the judgment on this world. Now the prince of this world will be driven out. And I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself. That word draw there is actually the word drag. It's the same word, you know, when I think it's post-resurrection, there's this, Peter has this miraculous catch. It's at like 153 fish, and it's talking about pulling the net onto the boat, and the boat's starting to sink because there's so many fish, and Peter working to drag this thing in. It's exactly the same word in the Greek. I will draw all people to myself. He said this to show the kind of death he was going to die. Now, the reason we're here this morning is because for those of us looking a little deeper at the cross, these words of Jesus are enormously significant. 3 times in Galilee, Jesus has privately foretold his crucifixion. 3 times his disciples didn't get it. They didn't have a grid for it. Some of them, I think, didn't believe it. They just weren't sure what he was talking about, all sorts of things. This is the first time that Jesus has spoken about his impending crucifixion publicly. And it is really essentially the only place in the Gospels where Jesus talks about his death upon the cross and what it actually means. Jesus says 3 things. He says, now is the judgment of the world. So Jesus is saying that the crucifixion will judge the world. Secondly, he says the crucifixion will cast out the ruler of the world. And we'll talk about that stuff a little bit next week. Today, I really want to talk about his third interpretive meaning that Jesus gives us concerning his own crucifixion. That the crucifixion will draw the whole world to Christ, or drag the world to Christ. But to get our heads around how Jesus refounds the world, we have to go back to the beginning. We have to go back to the primeval story of Cain and Abel. And the story goes like this, that there was a man named mankind, Adam, or Adam. And there was a woman named Life, or Eve. And mankind and life had 2 sons, Cain and Abel. Cain is a farmer. Abel is a shepherd. Cain belongs to the class of people that is harnessing agriculture and becoming settled and giving rise to civilization as we know it. Abel belongs to that nomadic class that doesn't see the land as something to be owned, but they move from pasture to pasture following the flocks. These 2 brothers, in amongst other things, they represent 2 ways of seeing the world. And not everything is peaceful. Genesis says that the trouble starts because God accepted Abel's offering, not Cain's. You'll find the story in Genesis 4, by the way. But there's more to it. Anthropologists say that when agriculture began to rise, there was conflict between those now settling farmers and nomadic shepherds. And the dispute was primarily over land. Could land be owned? Who owns the land? And after being warned by Yahweh that sin was after him, Cain leads Abel to a field. And that field becomes the world's first battlefield. Cain rises up and he kills his brother, Abel. Cain then tries to justify killing his brother. He lies to himself. He lies to God. Probably tells himself that he had no other choice, that he needed to protect his property, all that stuff. And the coup de grace is when he utters the now famous words to God, "Am I my brother's keeper?" Spoiler alert, yes he was. Cain he faces judgment and he moves east of Eden to establish the first city. Now remember, there's this geographical, I don't know what you call it, motif, this idea that we see play out in Genesis in particular. When people are shown moving east, they're moving away from God. As they move west, they're moving towards God, or they're returning to God. Cain is moving east. He moves east of Eden and he establishes the first city. Now, these two figures, Cain and Abel, are at the same time historical figures, but they're also archetypal figures. We're meant to see a little bit more about society and how we've organised ourselves in their story. And in Cain, the world is organised around an axis of power and force by violence. That's what the story wants you to get. That it's a zero-sum game. There are winners and there are losers. That if you want something, you want to protect something, you keep it safe by force. And if you have to kill to protect that, then so be it. The first city and all subsequent systems of civilization are founded according to the same pattern of violent power, which in turn becomes the organising principle for human civilization. We see it repeated throughout history in the rise of empires that are all largely founded, protected, and eventually overthrown through use of violence. You're talking about the biblical narrative. It's about the rise of Egypt and Assyria and Babylon and Persia and the Greeks. And then in the time of Jesus, Rome. And in fact, this idea of how civilizations are organised has become so ingrained in human culture that most of us just assume there's no other possibility, that this is the way things are. And there's an extent or a point where you're right. That's what you think. You're not far wrong. That is the way things are. But it doesn't have to stay that way. See, the story of Cain and Abel is an archetypal story that challenges us about the systems that we use in building empires, in governing ourselves. And there's a point where that darkness and that violence is stuff we'd rather not talk about it. But it's nevertheless there. And this axis of organisation plays out in everything from global politics to local playgrounds. The way you gain power, the way you assert dominance, is mostly through violence. Whether that violence is physical or verbal or threatened or implied. This is how life is. And it's not a one-off story. If we're really listening to the story of Cain and Abel, then we'll begin to hear it in other settings. Cain and Abel's story is played out again in the story of Romulus and Remus, the foundational myth of Rome. The story goes that two twin brothers have a conflict over where their city should be established. And then they have a conflict over who should rule that city. But because these brothers, they couldn't agree on location or who should rule or pretty much anything else, they begin to each to build their own city and start to fortify it with a wall. Remus keeps mocking Romulus's efforts. He keeps jumping over the wall and over the moat, and poking fun at what's going on. Romulus, he pokes fun at Romulus one too many times, and Romulus kills him. Some say Romulus kills him. Others say it was one of Romulus's followers. Whatever, Remus winds up dead. Romulus takes over both cities and names it after himself. Roma, or Rome. Tradition says that this happened on April 21st, 753 BC. So if you really want to celebrate the foundation of Rome, you've got a couple of weeks to organise yourself, just saying. The lesson of the story to anyone who heard it, particularly in the time of Rome, was that anyone who dares challenge our power will pay for it with their life. It's Cain and Abel again, isn't it? It's the story built into the very founding and culture of Rome. And they lived that stuff out. It's ancient history. But that story is still being told. Look at Gaza. Look at the Ukraine. Look at the various wars that are playing themselves out around the world. Look at the way some rulers are grasping for power at the moment. It's Cain and Abel. We see it in our fiction. I know I've read it, and I've probably bored you with it more than once. Lord of the Rings. How many of you have read it? Oh, guys, homework. Okay. Lord of the Rings. We see the story of Cain and Abel play out in the Lord of the Rings. The story of Smeagol and Deagol. Smeagol they're both fisher folk. Deagol, when they're out fishing one day, finds this ring. Smeagol decides he wants it. And on Smeagol's birthday, he kills his cousin Deagol to get the ring. Why on earth would you kill someone over a stupid ring? Because it's the ring of power. We see these stories come up again and again in our narrative. And they all point us to the dark truth that the fallen world is organised around this axis of power and enforced through violence. So when someone says this is just the way the world works, they're not wrong. But there's a better way. And Jesus gives us that better way. Jesus comes into the world to shine the light, to tell the truth, and to refound the world. To say that the way of Cain and Abel is not the way it has to be. Let me give you a sense of what I'm talking about. If we go back to that first Good Friday, having been betrayed by Jesus, he is arrested, by Judas. Jesus is arrested, and then in the Garden of Gethsemane, and after his arrest, he finds himself on trial at the front of the Sanhedrin. Things begin to escalate, and early in the morning, the Sanhedrin drag him off, and he finds himself standing before the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate. He's there because the Sanhedrin can't put him to death. Now, most of you will know, but just in case, Pontius Pilate, he's the imperial government. He's a representative of Caesar in Judea. He's ambitious, he's frustrated, he's disappointed with his station in life. Pontius is cynical and hard-bitten, and he wants more from his life than just being the governor of this far-flung, backwater, argumentative province called Judea, where he feels about as welcome as a circus performer at an undertaker's convention. I made that one up. Pontius doesn't like being there, and he doesn't like being dragged out of bed early in the morning, and yet both of those things have happened. And there's lots of yelling, and they're trying to make their point, but for Pontius, the issue is primarily theological in nature, and he doesn't care about that. He's got one question for Jesus. Are you the King of the Jews? That's what it hangs on. Caesar thinks he should be the King of the Jews. So if you tell me you are the King of the Jews, there's a problem. Jesus responds and says, my kingdom is not of this world. And this is a paraphrase, but he says it's for this world. But my kingdom is not from this world. It's not from any world that Pontius Pilate would understand. See, Pilate's understanding of the way the world works began with Cain. and Abel and the pharaohs and Babylon and Persia and Greece, and now Rome's having its time in the sun. Jesus says, my kingdom doesn't come from any of that. My kingdom is not from this world, because if it was, my servants would be fighting. But they're not, because that's not how the real kingdom comes. Pilate doesn't hear any of that. He just says, so you're a king then? Jesus says, well, you say I am. In fact, the reason I was born and came into the world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me. Pontius says, well, what is truth? And then basically has him dragged out of his presence and into the Antonia fortress to be flogged. That's Pontius's truth. What is truth? It's flogging. The entire garrison is roused when he's brought into the Antonia fortress next door. And this is the way of Rome. If you threaten the way of Rome, you will pay. So they strip Jesus, they tie him to a post, they give him a brutal flogging. Included being beaten with rods and whips, and often those whips would have shrapnel attached to the ends of them so that they would grip and then rip the flesh. Again, if Jesus is not God, this is dime a dozen. And the thing is, Roman soldiers had gotten so used to abusing human bodies that this became kind of sport. They were bored. They needed entertainment. And so early on a Friday morning, as Roman centurions flogged this man, this is what they did. They had some fun. They asked one another, what's this guy accused of? And someone responds, well, he's accused of being king of the Jews. And they look at this beaten, bloodied body and say, well, doesn't look much like a king. Let's find him some stuff to make him look like a king. And they go and find a purple robe. And they drape it over Jesus' bloody body. That looks better. And then someone says, well, hang on, if he's a king needs a scepter. And so he goes and gets a bamboo rod and he beats Jesus with it before placing it beside him. So now Jesus has a purple robe draped over him and a scepter right next to him. And then some bright spark of a Roman centurion goes up and says, well, a real king needs a crown, and fashions a crown of thorns, and he places it on Jesus' head. Not gently, roughly. And as streams of blood run down Jesus' face, they bow down to him and they hail him as king. And the irony of all of this is that this macabre ceremony where Rome and its servants were intending to mock and jeer a so-called king of the Jews is in fact the coronation of the world's true king. That's part of what John is laying out for us in this story. See, Rome knew that the world revolved around an axis of power enforced through violence. They knew that, because that's how they came to power. Jesus threatened that. He'd offered an alternative narrative. In his ministry, Jesus would heal people that the culture had just cast aside. Jesus taught forgiveness for those who wrong you. Love your enemies. He didn't teach revenge. He didn't teach an eye for an eye. That's not the way of Cain and Abel. That's not the way of Rome. Not the way the world works. And this massive empire felt threatened by this one person who was talking about love, redemptive love, forgiveness, grace, mercy. And they acted in the only way they knew how. Violence. See, the very moment that the minions of the empire were trying to mock the Son of God is the very moment where their whole way of operating in the world is being exposed as a lie. False. Because instead of mocking the would-be king, they're bowing down to the world's true king. And after this coronation ceremony, Jesus is taken before Pilate a second time. In their first meeting, Pilate asked the loaded question, what is truth? In the second meeting, Pilate actually answers his own question. Jesus is standing before him, silent. And Pilate says in John 19:10, "Don't you realize I have the power to either release you or crucify you?" That's Pilate's truth. He's deeply cynical, but he genuinely believes what he's saying here. He's saying this is the truth. The world is run by people like me, people who have power, the power to kill. But Jesus knows something better. Jesus knows that Pilate's so-called truth is in fact Cain's ancient lie, and it's doomed to failure. The whole world has been founded upon the lie that the world is organised upon an axis of power reinforced by violence. And the world knows there's no other way. But Jesus has come to expose that lie, to tell the truth, to shine the light, and to ultimately re-found the world. And Jesus quite brilliantly replies to Pilate. He said, "You've got no power here, except that which has been given to you from above." In other words, I'm operating to a whole different authority structure. I'm doing things a different way. Jesus says as much when he says, "My kingdom is not of this world." In other words, my kingdom is not of Cain and Abel's lineage. And that's what Jesus, as the world's true king, accomplishes at the cross. The organising principle of the world is no longer violent power, but co-suffering, saving, forgiving love. Pilate has a choice. In the end, he chooses to assert the only kind of power that he knows, and he sends Jesus to the cross. And so, still wearing the crown of thorns, Jesus goes to the cross while being jeered and spat upon. But before he dies, he looks out at those who nailed him to the cross. He looks at the mouths of those who spat on him. He looks at the faces of those who have mocked him. And he forgives. "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing." And in so doing, he refounds the world, changes it in an instant. At the cross, Jesus refounds the world around an axis of love expressed in forgiveness. And the crucified and risen Christ is now in the process of drawing all people to himself. See, the gravity of grace is drawing the world into a new and saving orbit. We can resist that, but it takes energy and it takes time. I think after his death, in what I think is one of the more powerful passages of Scripture, this Roman centurion looks at the scene and he confesses, "Surely this man was the Son of God." One of the soldiers who participated in Jesus' coronation starts to see the world in a new light. He sees the ugliness of all that has just taken place, the hollowness of the way of power backed by violence. And he confesses that surely this one is the Son of God. You know, we talked about it just at the very start when I read the passage about Jesus saying he's going to draw all people, drag all people to himself. It started. Jesus is offering the world a new way, a better way. And I think as we look at the cross, it forces us to answer significant questions about the way the world works and the way we operate in it. It forces us to ask, is true power found in the one holding the hammer or the one with the nail-pierced hands? Is true strength revealed in the one who mocks and spits or the one who offers forgiveness and grace? Ultimately, it asks us about the kind of world we're operating in and participating in and building. Is the organising principle of the world power achieved through violence, or is it co-suffering love? One of the things that Jesus does at the cross is he tells us, he shows us we don't have to believe Cain's old lie. That we can see our brother as our brother and not the enemy. Helps us embrace the idea we are our brother's keeper. The way Jesus invites us to organise the Jesus way invites us to organise our lives around the Christ-centred truth that every human is my neighbour, that I have never met a person who is not created in the image of God. And the church, through the cross and the resurrection of Jesus, continue to refound the world on an axis of love that is expressed through forgiveness and grace and mercy. And all that happens as we continue our orbit around Christ crucified and allow him to draw us into this way of grace, this way of love, wholehearted love for God, wholehearted love for neighbour. I guess my prayer this morning is, God, would you let us live this way? Give us the imagination to see it. The cross is many things. It's the way of forgiveness. It is the beauty that saves the world. But it's also the moment where God refounds the world on an axis of love through sacrifice. Why don't we bow our heads, and Soren and Marcella and Steph will come and close us up. Jesus, I keep thinking about this idea that you show us a better way, that you came and shone a light, that you showed us a better way to live, and that way of living leads to life that is truly life. Lord, would you give us a holy imagination that says that the way things are isn't necessarily the way things need to be. Help us as members of this new community that you have drawn together, as members of your kingdom, to live this better narrative, to reach out in love, to offer forgiveness and mercy, to share hope where we can. Lord, help us see that there is a better way, and let us give ourselves to that. Lord, thank you for your grace and for your mercy and for your love present with us now. Thank you for what we see at the cross, that it is more than one thing. That all the tongues, given all of eternity, will never plumb the true depth of the riches that we find in what you did for us on that Good Friday and what was completed and sealed on Easter Sunday. May this be truly life-changing for us, Jesus. Amen.